Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Meg Rasmussen. I'm the Executive Director here at Georges River Land Trust, and we are thrilled to be bringing you a webinar entitled Nature's Best Hope with Dr. Doug Tallamy. As you know, Dr. Tallamy is going to speak for about an hour. Then we're going to have question and answers, but if you think of one, go ahead and at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Go ahead and type it in, and then at the end, we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. So you're here because you care, and the Georges River Land Trust also cares, and we need to find a better way of taking care of our planet. It's no doubt, and today we're going to learn a little bit about why it's important and how we can all do our own part in our own backyards to make that happen. So you can see the painting, beautiful painting behind me. It's by Greg Mort, and it shows an image of our beautiful earth, just the way he does. And it just so happens that this picture is called Stewardship. So what better backdrop than this for our discussion today? So let's get right to it. I'm going to introduce Dr. Tallamy. He is a professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware. He's a researcher, a teacher, and an award-winning best-selling author. So it's no wonder he can really bridge that scientific gulf between the world of research and science and the rest of us. And really that will help empower us to bring back the balance between humanity and the natural world that so beautifully supports us. So take it away, Dr. Tallamy.
All right, thank you, Meg. Looking for my cursor, there we go. Okay, I wanna, thanks for coming, everybody, today. I wanna talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I wanna remind you of what happened last fall. I'm not sure if this got up to Maine, but at least from Massachusetts down to Georgia and all the way to the Mississippi, we had what we call an oak mast. In the red oak group, all the red oaks got together and they decided they would make their acorns at the same time. And they did. They made a lot of acorns that looked like this in a lot of places. Well, if you're easily entertained like I am, maybe you took one of those acorns and just stared at it, and maybe you saw this happen. A little blemish occurred on the side and it started to move, and it was pretty obvious something was chewing its way out of the acorn. It was an insect larva, and it chewed and it pushed and it squished, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, finally plopped to the ground. Very dangerous time for this larva because it is good to eat. Everything wants to eat an insect larva like this. So it's got to get below the ground as fast as possible. It does a little bit more squishing and squirming and twisting. And in about 30 seconds, down it goes, where it stretches in all directions and makes a little chamber and converts itself into a pupa. Now, what's interesting about this pupa is it stays underground for 2 years, not just 1 year, but 2 years. And when it comes out, it is an acorn weevil. This is what a weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have long noses because it looks like it, but it's actually an extension of the head capsule, and their mouth parts are right at the end of that extension. So this is really the head, and that's where the mouth is. They use that long extension to chew a hole down into the center of the acorn. Female turns around, lays an egg here, and the larva crawls down, and that's how it gets into the center of the acorn for its very safe development. Now you might wonder why it spends 2 years underground instead of just 1. Well, that's because red oak acorns take 18 months to develop, and if they came out the very next year, there'd be a very small crop for them. Well, when they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, and nature abhors a vacuum. But some things love a vacuum, like these temnothorax ants. There are 3 species of temnothorax ants that live in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils and acorns. And when they find a brand new acorn with a hole in it, they get very excited. And what they want to do is move their entire colony in there. So they do. They go to the old dilapidated acorn and grab their larvae and their eggs, and they carry their queen. And everybody moves in within about 30 minutes And they post a guard at the door here, make sure nobody else comes in. And they'll live in this acorn until it falls apart, which is about 2 years later. Well, about this time, my wife says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? My point is that this is a specialized relationship between acorns and weevils and ants that occurs right in my yard. It probably occurs in your yard too if you have oaks. Here's another one, the dispersal of acorns by blue jays. Nature is built from literally millions of these types of interactions. If you want pileated woodpeckers breeding in your yard, you've got to have a lot of carpenter ants because that's what they feed their young. And you're not going to have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You're not going to have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this flower, Phacelia. It's the only pollen that bee will reproduce on. As a matter of fact, there are 13 species of native bees in the Northeast that will not reproduce unless they have the pollen of various species of Helianthus, of sunflower. You're not going to have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. And I could go on for hours talking about these specialized relationships. Today, the problem is that these types of relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes largely because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. And Teddy heard about this and he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that today we can no longer leave the country as it was because we've already changed it. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine state. Because we have logged the country. Actually, we've logged the country many times over. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland. And of course, we've paved it and developed it. We have straightened the rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our atmosphere, changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are now have escaped and are running amok in our native plant communities. In short, we have carved up nature into tiny remnants of its former self, little fragments that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that in turn support humans. Why have we done all these things? Well, we thought that our nest, the earth, was so big, we could do whatever we wanted forever and we could never foul it. But of course we were wrong. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? We're talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. Let me remind you how big a billion is. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. It's a lot of seconds. And now we've got about 1/3 of the bird population absent, gone in the last 50 years. Followed by this headline, the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in possibly the next 20 years, which by the way, that's not an option. You know, this isn't just a report. It's like saying, we're only going to lose our oxygen in the next 20 years. No, can't do that. It's not an option. Well, I could go on. I could go on about the pox that we've visited upon the earth and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will take a little bit of effort from a lot of people, but that will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline. Insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the most famous entomologist of our time, Harvard emeritus professor at this point. He's 92 this year, and he still writes a book a year. He told us what it means, or would mean, if we were to lose our insects. He wrote this paper in 1987 called The Little Things That Run the World, and his message was very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects. If they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if our flowering plants disappeared, it would change not just the physical structure of terrestrial Earth, but it would change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats. In other words, it would collapse the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, and they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot as opposed to having rapid turnover of nutrients by insect decomposers, because they would be gone. You'd only have bacteria and fungi left. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news here, though, and that is that none of this has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. But in order to do that, we're going to have to change the way we landscape. Let's just review briefly why we need to do that. So many people either were never taught or do not remember that humans are a product of nature. We are totally dependent on functioning ecosystems. So having them disappear is that's, again, not an option. Why? Because they produce what we call ecosystem services. What do we get from plants? These are just short lists of what we get. How about the production of oxygen? Plants clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Here's an enormously important one right now. They capture carbon, pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and then put it in their tissues, but then they also pump it into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put into the ground, where it is out of harm's way. It's not going to change the climate once it's in the ground. Plants build our topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for these plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate, again, 90% of our flowering plants and 80% of all plants. They disperse plant seeds and many other things. So designing landscapes that destroy the production of these types of services, again, is not an option. It never was a good option. But today, with 7.8 billion people on the planet, can't afford to do this anymore. We need as many ecosystem services as possible. There are visionaries through the years who recognized our poor relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent in the 1900s. He wrote a lot of things. One of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been a few indigenous groups who were good at doing that, but by and large, humans have been terrible at doing that, particularly our current Western culture, our extractive culture. Take as much as we can from the planet as fast as we can, so we can make a lot of money, but not thinking much into the future. So Aldo said, we need to change that. We need to develop what we call a land ethic. He had a dream of developing a land ethic. We would use the land. We would farm it and lumber it and graze it and mine it and hunt on it. But we would learn how to do this without destroying local ecosystems. And he saw this really as the future. What he didn't write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect it's because the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place was so deeply embedded in Aldo's culture, and it's still embedded in our own culture, that he didn't recognize it as an option. What I'm going to argue today is that living with nature not only is an option, I think it's the only viable option that is left to us right now. Of course, in the past, conservationists worked exclusively where people aren't. We need to change that. Now we need to conserve nature. We need to save it, really, recreate it, restore it where people are. So that's it. We've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to start? Well, there are a lot of places we can start, but one place we cannot ignore is privately owned property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignore private property, we're going to fail, because that means we're only doing conservation on 15% of the land, assuming we do it on all public property, which is not nearly enough to do successful conservation. But there are a number of places that we don't think of as potential areas where we could do conservation, like power and pipeline rights of ways. We've got 20 million acres, 21 million acres of those. Railroad rights of ways, roadsides, many more millions of acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge places that we can do a lot of conservation on. Then we have all the places where we live, millions, hundreds of millions of acres there. If you add all that up, that's 599 million acres. And there's many other opportunities you could think of to add to this list. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, even Texas. You add up all of those states, less than 599 million acres. So not having a place to do conservation is not the problem. We've got plenty of places. What are we going to do in all these areas where we're renewing nature? We need to rebuild it, all parts of it, but all parts don't contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we need to start with the building blocks. We need to put the species back that support other species best. And one of the things we want to do is rebuild food webs, because if you don't have the food webs that take the energy from plants and deliver it to other animals, that's it. You don't have anything but plants. So who does that the best? Caterpillars. It turns out it's caterpillars transferring more energy from plants to any other type of plant eater worldwide, more than elephants or anything else. So if you took caterpillars out of the system, most of the energy would remain locked up in plants. So it turns out, we don't think about this, but it turns out that most animals do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something is usually insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Let's use a chickadee as an example. All the chickadee species are doing the same thing. They're eating seeds in the wintertime, but during the breeding season, they reproduce on insects. And when they're in a healthy environment, those insects typically are caterpillars, and they are not exceptions. Most birds, 96% of our terrestrial birds, are rearing their young on insects. And we have found out that most of those insects are caterpillars. And this is one of the data sets that suggests that. One of my grad students, recent grad students, is Ashley Kennedy, who did a citizen science project with bird photographers all over the country. She asked them to send her pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were bringing food to the nest. She identified what the prey item was in the bill, and this is data for 20 families of birds in North America. The green bar represents the percentage of the nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 bird families represented here, caterpillars dominate the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if you took caterpillars out of the system. You would lose reproduction in 16 out of the 20 bird families in North America. Why caterpillars? What is special about caterpillars? Well, there's a number of things that are special. One is that they are relatively soft prey items. If you think of this guy as a sausage with a very thin wrapper, the thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, it's not digestible. So you don't want a lot of that. And then everything else is good food inside there. And because it's soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring the esophagus. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young or feed their young, they're pretty rough. They use their bill like a plunger and they just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious, very high in fat, very high in protein, have a low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles, which are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks, and they have a lot of sharp edges. So you don't get a lot of good food from a beetle. You get a lot of chitin that you can't digest. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make carotenoids, yet they are essential in our diet. We have to get them. Only plants make carotenoids, so we have to get them from plants. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, and I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. She makes sure I get all of those things. For one thing, they stimulate my immune system. And I cannot think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. They're antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. What he does is take those luteins, build pigments out of them, put them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting the carotenoids? They're getting them from the prey items that they eat, but carotenoids are not distributed equally among the invertebrates that birds are eating. These first two bars here that have the most carotenoids by far are types of caterpillars. The third bar is are orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. The adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves, way down here, far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's their caterpillars that ate the green leaves. Here's the earthworm way down here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this influence the way birds pick out their prey items? Well, this is another data set from Ashley Kennedy that suggests it does. She put GoPro cameras on the roofs of bluebird houses. She had a lot of bluebird houses and a lot of GoPro cameras that took a picture once every second. And she did it for 3 years. So she actually had more than 1 million pictures to go through. But out of that 1 million pictures, she had 7,628 that caught the bird as it was flying into the box or sitting on the box with the prey item in its beak. And she could identify what the prey item was. Well, we knew what the carotenoid content of each one of these things was, and her pictures gave her the frequency with which they were brought to the nest. So we got to see there's a pretty good relationship between the most sought after prey item, which is caterpillars, and the amount of carotenoids that they have in their bodies, followed by number 2, the orthopteroids, and then everybody else is nestled down here in the where there's very few carotenoids. So all this suggests that, at least for birds, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It appears that they are essential parts of the diet. Okay, birds need caterpillars. How many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Is it going to give them what they need? Well, again, let's ask this question for Carolina chickadees, although they are representative of most other birds. It takes thousands of caterpillars to bring 1 clutch of chickadees through to maturity. 6,000 to 9,000, just to get them to leave the nest. Then the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days after they leave the nest, and they're flying all around, so nobody's counted that. So we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars to build a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. Now, if you want chickadees breeding in your yard, they're going to forage about 50 meters from the nest, which means if you want chickadees breeding in your yard, you need thousands and thousands of caterpillars to be produced in your yard. The chickadees are not going to fly 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot to find those caterpillars. So when we build yards and landscapes that do not make enough caterpillars, do not make enough insects, birds decline. At least that's what all the data suggests. That study that said we have 3 billion fewer birds in North America, they listed all their data on a website, Rosenberg et al., and we took a look at it to see that not all birds are declining equally. As a matter of fact, some actually grew. And it turns out the ones that added individuals to their populations are ones that do not require insects in their diet. It's the doves and the finches and other things that can reproduce on seeds. But the birds that do require insects in their diet or in their life history at some point declined on average, about 10 million individuals per species. So the declines are focused on insectivores. Which means, again, we need to landscape for caterpillars. How do we do that? That has not been our goal in the past. Well, you add caterpillars to your landscapes by adding the plants that make them. There is a catch, and that is not all plants make caterpillars. It's too bad, because otherwise we could pick any plant from any place and we'd have lots of caterpillars. But it's not the case. And the monarch here represents that very well. If you want to make monarch butterflies, you can't put boxwood or crepe myrtle or Norway maple or almost any other plant in the landscape. The only thing that is going to make monarchs is milkweeds. They're host plant specialists, and it turns out most caterpillars, most insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Why do they have to specialize? Well, remember, plants really don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green outside. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat those plants. They are too well protected. And if you don't believe me, after the talk, go outside and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not gonna like it. You're not gonna like it. There is a reason it is hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they are toxic. That's a joke. Well, anyway, we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. How do monarchs eat milkweeds? Milkweeds are poisonous plants. Well, what they do over evolutionary time is develop the adaptations that allow them to circumvent all of the defenses of milkweeds or the lineage that the insect happens to choose. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify compounds that are protecting the leaves. They develop life history adaptations and behavioral adaptations that allow them to minimize their exposure to those nasty compounds. But again, it takes a long period of exposure to that particular plant lineage. They cannot get around the defenses of every type of plant that is out there. So they specialize. They only do it on particular ones. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. The choice of plants we use to put into our landscapes is going to determine how many other organisms are in that landscape. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how this works. Just to emphasize that it does work. It works on any scale. Let's start with a larger scale. Our property here in Oxford, Pennsylvania, we own 10 acres. And this is what it looked like before we moved in. It was a farm that was sold and broken up. It had been mowed for hay before we moved in. So there were very few plants there. Actually, it was out of mowing 3 years before we actually moved in. And in the meantime, who moved in was all the invasive plants that we have here in Southeast Pennsylvania. So that's Cindy right there. She's getting ready to get rid of multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and Norway maple and Callery pear and privet and all the ones that are there. Looks like an impossible job, particularly for 10 acres, but Cindy has proven it is not impossible. It is a lot of work. You have to stick to it, but you can do it. What I was putting plants back, and I chose the plants that would bring in caterpillars that I wanted to take pictures of. We might as well have fun with this. And one of the ones I wanted to take pictures of was the Canadian owlet. I had read Canadian owlets look like this. I want to take that picture, but in order to have them, that's what the adult looks like, just like leaves. You have to have meadow rue. Well, we didn't have any meadow rue. I didn't know of any meadow rue nearby. So I got some seeds of meadow rue from some friend of mine, planted them, but I didn't know. I thought it actually would be years before Canadian owlets could actually find my isolated patches of meadow rue. So I did not check them. Maybe 2 months, went out 2 months after I planted. There were good meadow rue there, but they were practically defoliated because the Canadian owlets had found them so fast. It really took me by surprise. It was a wonderful success, and now I have a thriving colony of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. Same story with goldenrod stowaway, which is a misnomer. These beautiful yellow moths have nothing to do with goldenrod. They are specialists on this plant, Biden's aristosa, which is, some people call it ditch daisy. Again, we didn't have any Biden's aristosa. I got some seeds from a power line cut 12 miles away. And now we have a lot of Biden's aristosa and a lot of goldenrod stowaways. I wanted hackberry emperor because it's a butterfly that ought to be here. It should be at our house, but it requires hackberry. We didn't have any hackberries. So I planted, I think 7 hackberries. I went out this past June and looked at the branches of one of my hackberries. There were 9 hackberry emperors on there. Another big success. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came the things that eat goldenrod, things like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparagnothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Here's what I'm waiting for, goldenrod flower moth. We have been here. This is our 20th year, and this guy still has not found our goldenrod. That's what its caterpillars look like. So this is anticipation. Every year I get to anticipate the goldenrod flower moth, like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Hasn't happened yet, but one of these years it's going to, and it'll be a great day. Same story with the Virginia creeper. I planted Virginia creeper because I wanted to take that picture. I wanted the Pandora Sphinx to come in. I wanted to take that picture. Beautiful creatures. But while I was waiting for the Pandora Sphinx, we got the lettered Sphinx, we got the hog Sphinx, lots of other things that eat Virginia creeper, the Abbott Sphinx, wonderful creatures. Wanted the zebra swallowtail, so we planted pawpaw. Had to wait longer this time. This one took 9 years for the zebras to find it because the nearest population's 26 miles away, but they finally did. In the meantime, we got the pawpaw Sphinx. Didn't know there was a pawpaw Sphinx, but we got it, and lots of pawpaws. Wanted the double-toothed prominence, so we planted American elm. We wanted the evening primrose moth, so we planted evening primrose, and now the little guys can hide during the day in the flowers. That's what they do. And we planted lots of oaks. And these are just, a smattering of the plants we put in our 10 acres, but oaks turn out to be the most powerful plant we could add. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's a big fella. But a lot of people think you need a giant oak like that before it can start contributing to your landscape. And they say, I won't live long enough to enjoy my oak. Yes, you will. Yes, you will, because you can start enjoying it right away. The oaks I put in our property, I either planted as acorns or small bare root whips about 2 feet high. And right away, they brought in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property. And they come right away. This is a pin oak. Just first year, poking out of the ground here, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start contributing. This is a picture taken of our house from the same place I took that first picture. We have a little lawn here. We're very traditional. But I put the plants back, or I'm still putting plants back. And each plant lineage that I put into our yard brings more moth species. So when I saw how many species were coming, I decided I would try to take pictures of every species on our property. I am up to 1,012 species of moths, not butterflies, haven't gotten there yet. And 1,012 species of bird food. Each one of those feeds the birds. And because of that, we have found 55 species of birds breeding on our 10 acres. So it works. I saw this headline, 2 days ago, World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of wildlife had vanished since 1970. Not at our house, not at our house. As a matter of fact, I'll bet we have added 2/3 of the wildlife to our little space because we put the plants back. Can this work in suburbia? Yeah, I know you're saying, well, everybody doesn't own 10 acres. I just own little piece in suburbia, and I bet it won't work. Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. Kirkwood's outside of St. Louis. And they're a typical suburban lot. They own 0.6 acres, so less than 1 acre. They're surrounded by people with their big lawns. The big invasive plant in St. Louis is bush honeysuckle. And first thing they did was get rid of their bush honeysuckle, but then they planted a bunch of native plants, and they put in what they call a bubbler. It's a little water feature that bubbles down. And then they sat back and started to count the bird species that come to their yard. They're up to 149 species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, on our 10 acres, we've recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So they're doing real well on their 0.6 acres. Can it work in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's yard in Chicago, Illinois. And I mean in Chicago. She lives right next to one of the runways for O'Hare Airport. She lives right next to Kennedy Expressway. She has 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in the US. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a little water feature for the birds, and no connectivity with preserved land at all. She is an island, but she's recorded 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Chicago to Pam's house and look at one. What about inner cities, though? You know, 82% of the US population now lives in what's defined as a city. In 2014, I was looking at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa, common name butterfly weed. But that reminds me that we have a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. So looking at Monarch's Delight, the first thing I saw was this megachilid bee, leafcutter bee. I know it's a leafcutter bee because it collects its pollen on its tummy, not on its legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. They require nectar and pollen, but they also require soft leaves, things like redbud leaves that they can cut the edges out of. And then they roll them up into a tube and stuff it full of pollen and stick that in a crack, and that's how they reproduce. Well, right next to Monarch's Delight, there was a redbud. So the leafcutter bees had everything they needed. But that redbud, of course, bloomed early in the season, which provided early forage for queen bumblebees. Queen bumblebees do everything themselves because there are no workers yet. So they need a lot of early forage or their nests will fail. There were bumblebees there. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw two monarchs on Monarch's Delight. And remember, this is 2014. In 2013, I had gone the entire year without seeing any monarchs. So I was excited. And it was also June. We don't usually see monarchs this far north in June. And they were there because they had Monarch's Delight. They also had other species of milkweeds, exactly what they needed. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in Manhattan. And this is what the High Line looks like. It is a converted elevated railroad. We're 30 feet above the pavement with roaring taxis and everything else. I mean, this is Manhattan. This is not a preserve. Yet that was enough productive planting. It's not 100% native, but there are some thoughtful native plantings there. And if we can bring life back to the center of Manhattan, I was surprised. I didn't think they could find it, but they did. If we can bring life to the center of Manhattan with thoughtful native plantings, we can do it anywhere. So I was very encouraged. There are 4 keys to success, though, that I want to talk about. And one of them is, at least across the US, we have to shrink the area that's in lawn. Because we have more than 40 million acres of lawn. It's the size of New England. It looks like this right now. And lawn is a deadscape. You know, this is not going to improve global insect decline or bird decline or loss of biodiversity or anything else. And it wrecks our watersheds. You know about lawn. It's a status symbol that we need to start to rein in. So I'm suggesting that we cut the area of lawn in half, put in powerful plants, and half the area that we have in lawn. And if we do that, if we replant half the area that's in lawn, we can create a new national park that'll be 20 million acres in size. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. There are real benefits to bringing nature right to where you live, building that little parkscape at home. And the biggest one is that you can then develop a personal relationship with nature, something most people have lost at this point. But build for the first time or reestablish a personal relationship with nature at your own pace when you are able to do that. You can do it avoiding crowds. It's free. Nobody's going to charge you to go do this. You can avoid travel hassles. But most of all, you get to experience nature alone. You're not going to develop that personal relationship with a bunch of people hanging around. You know, right now we're worried about our kids having little or no exposure to nature. So we put them on a bus with a teacher, 30 kids on a bus, and take them to some park. And they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything, and then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that is their exposure to the natural world. Admittedly, that is better than nothing, but it is not the way they're going to develop that personal relationship. This is the way you hunt lizards. And I'm learning this from my granddaughter, Zoe, who sent me this picture. She lives in Hawaii, and her little patch of nature is little, about 10 feet by 10 feet, regular lawn with some shrubs. But nevertheless, she has invented hunting lizards as her relationship with nature. And this is how you do it. You disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly on the ground, and you better be serious about it. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. And then you sneak up on the anole lizards and you catch them. So this is something she does in her tiny little patch of the earth. And you know, she won't be doing it forever, but I guarantee she will remember this close experience she's had with nature for the rest of her life. If you want to do more than hunt lizards, you can get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Strunisty. Lots of great ideas of things you can do in very small home landscapes. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. The plants we're going to put in that area, many of them are going to be what I call keystone plants. What's a keystone plant? Well, it turns out that not all native plants are equal in their ability to support the life we want to bring to our yards. Only 5% of them are making about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives the food webs that we're talking about here. 14% of our native plants make 90% of the caterpillar food, which means there are a whole lot of native plants that aren't doing very much. So the question is no longer simply are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but I can build a 100% native landscape that supports very little if I choose the plants that aren't supporting a lot. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes, the ones that are going to support other species, or do we want benign plants or even worse, ecologically destructive plants, those invasive species that escape and wreck our natural areas? I get emails once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgo biloba, ginkgo from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. So that means they're native, and that means we can plant them. Well, remember, this is not our metric anymore. We can argue about whether 7 million years ago is native today, but I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. Nothing can eat a ginkgo. So if you're trying to enhance local wildlife, ginkgo's not going to do it. That's what it boils down to. What is going to do it? Well, in the mid-Atlantic states, there are 557 species of caterpillars on oaks, 557 species of bird food, 900 species nationwide. Now, admittedly, as you go farther north, you get up into northern Maine and stuff, the oaks drop out and the conifers take over. But oaks in general around the country are the most powerful genus you can put into the landscape in 84% of the counties of North America. What does that mean? What does this keystone genus mean in my yard? Remember, I've taken pictures of 1,012 moss species. We're still going, I'm getting new ones all the time. But out of that 1,012 species, 888 have known host plants. We know what they eat. Of the 888 species, 261 use oaks. Now we've got 59 genera of native woody plants on our property and hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants, but only one of those genera is Quercus, the genus of oaks. So oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species, 29% of our moss species. So imagine what would happen if we took that single keystone plant out of the landscape. What would happen to the diversity? What would happen to the birds that depend on those caterpillars? So how do you know what the keystone species are for where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder at the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of plants for your county will pop up. So for most places in Maine, actually willows are #1 here, followed by oaks and native prunus. Poplars and cottonwoods and aspens are very high on the list. Native maples, blueberries very high on your list. These are all woodies. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. You can go to the nursery and buy a Chinese oak. You can buy an English oak. I can't imagine why you would do that since we have 90 species of oaks in North America. You can get a non-native cherry, an Asian cherry. You can get weeping willow, which is from the Middle East. But when you get these non-native species, you're reducing the caterpillar use of these plants by 68%, even though it's a native genus. Here are the top ranking herbaceous plants. Goldenrod's number one, followed by various asters and those sunflowers we talked about. Just with these three genera, you're supporting a lot of species of specialized bees that can only reproduce on the pollen from these plants. So it's over 40 species of specialist bees on these particular plants. Now the list goes on, but I just stopped because I ran out of room. This is how you find out what the most plants for your county is. All right, so we're gonna reduce the lawn. We're gonna plant keystone plants, and they will bring life to your yard. And then if you have security lights on, it will kill them. So this all works well unless you have a lot of night light pollution. And how do lights kill, particularly moths? Lots of different ways. Exhaustion, those little fly around the light. You know, after 100 years of wondering why they do that, we still don't know. But they do. They hit the light, they get incinerated, they die from dehydration. Bats come and pick them off. A lot of night insects are blinded by bright lights like this. They've never had bright lights before. And then it wrecks their daily life cycles of the things they need to do. So it's turning out, research particularly from Europe is showing that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, at least in the temperate zone, which actually is good news because it is easy to turn off your light, very easy. But if you don't want, I know you're not going to do that because you say, well, the bad man will come if I don't have my security light on. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is how often the bad man does not come. If you don't want to do this, you don't want to use a motion sensor, put a yellow light in your security light. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than are white wavelengths. And yellow LED lights are the least attractive. If the country switched to yellow LED lights, we could save billions of insects almost overnight. Very easy to do. Another thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. We're trying to bring caterpillars to our landscape to support those food webs, but if they can't turn into moths and complete the cycle, it's not going to work. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. In Chester County, Pennsylvania, 511 species of caterpillars develop on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the leaves, on the tree itself. They eat the leaves, then they spin a cocoon and hang from the branch of the oak tree, and then the adult emerges and they do it again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94% of them, 480 of those species, drop from the tree and wiggle themselves underneath the soil where they form a pupa, or they spin a cocoon among the leaves, the leaf litter under the tree. The problem is we don't have any leaf litter under the trees, and we compact our soil so that it's like concrete and the caterpillars cannot get underneath there. So this becomes an ecological trap. We're planting trees that call in the moths to lay their eggs, and the caterpillars develop and drop to the ground and die. And it's one of the causes, I'm sure, nobody's measured it, but I guarantee this is one of the causes of insect declines around the country. The cement landscape is even more destructive to moth populations. I am not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. This is just laziness, and it wrecks our watersheds. We know we should not be doing this. This is what most people do. They put a tree in the middle of a big lawn, or they put a big lawn around a tree. Nobody has measured the success of moths in trying to complete their life cycle in a situation like this, but I guarantee it's going to be higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree followed by a layered landscape. Here's a native azalea. You could have a dogwood over here, ferns, ground covers. This is safe site. The caterpillars drop down here and nobody's going to step on them. Nobody's going to mow them. The ground is very soft. They can get underground easily. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. You can put in your ground covers, your wild ginger, your mayapple, your foam flower. Lots of options there. Your ferns. All of those are safe sites for the caterpillars. One of the most exciting things to me is what we've learned recently about compromise. And this comes from my other grad student, Desiree Narango, who's also graduated at this point. She worked with Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. What she did was look at how well chickadee populations reproduce over time in landscapes that are either dominated by native plants or dominated by introduced ornamentals. None of the native landscapes were 100% native. They all had some non-native plants in there. These are suburban sites inside the Beltway, right in Washington, D.C. And the first thing she found is that landscapes that had a lot of introduced plants produced 75% fewer caterpillars. So there's 75% less bird food there, right from the get-go, which meant they were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. There's a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and they'd say, there's just not enough food here. We're not going to even try. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. They produced 1.2 fewer fledglings if they did survive, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. You might say, well, those aren't tremendous differences. But when you put all that together into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native plant biomass in the landscape, from no non-native plants to 100% non-native plant, this is what you get. The dotted line here represents replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. If you reproduce at this rate, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you reproduce more, if you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population over here. And if you make fewer babies than adults that are dying, you've got a shrinking population. That's over here. Notice that's when you've got a lot of non-native plants. Right here is the overlap point, around 30% non-native plants. So you can have a successful, either sustainable or growing population when you have fewer than 30% non-native plant biomass in the landscape. But when you've got more than 30%, you're in trouble zone here. Well, this is the point that's interesting to me. First of all, this is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So if anybody is still wondering whether your plant choice will impact the things around you that could be sharing your property, then check out this study. But it's this area of compromise that's exciting to me, because if my message was that you could have no non-native plants in your yard, very few people would listen to me. But you can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtle or your boxwood or whatever else you want, non-invasive, non-native. It's not going to contribute anything, but it won't destroy, it won't overpower the 70% of the native landscape that you have there. And you can still have a sustainable breeding bird population. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Of course they can. This is, somebody sent me this picture in the spring, and I have lost track of who it actually was, but it's the land manager of this formal garden here. And what he's doing is sneaking in native plants. So this is Joe Pye. I'm not going to call it Joe Pye weed. It's Joe Pye. And his goal is to replace all of these non-native plants with natives to demonstrate that you really can make a formal native garden. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess it's okay over there because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into this traditional suburban lot without it offending anybody? Of course we can. We put a little fence around it. Look at all the plants you have here. It's wonderful for local pollinators. If everybody did that, our native bee population would have a big boost. Here, you can do it without a fence. It's a bigger pollinator garden. Imagine the life that is here versus the life that is here. This is Heather Holmes' property. Heather, I don't know if you've had her to talk, but she writes books about native bees. This is what it looked like when she moved in. She got rid of a lot of her hardscape and put in forage plants for her native bees. So you can do that and got rid of the lawn. It's very, very possible to do this. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more are doing that. The state of Minnesota has a cost sharing program to encourage homeowners to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate prairie plantings, and they help you pay for it. It's a wonderful program. Some of the small islands off the coast of Florida are paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in their front yard. If they do that, they get a tax break. And this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. It should have been written with carrots, not sticks, so that you are rewarded for protecting endangered species rather than punished for being near them. Everybody would want an endangered species on their property then. Missouri had, I don't know if this continues, but it had a bounty on calorie pears, on invasive Bradford pear. If you brought in a calorie pear body, you got a free tree replacement. And of course, there's all the lawn replacement programs in the far west, California. $2 per square foot if you convert it to an appropriate xeric native planting. So yes, municipalities can help. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and by the early years, I mean last century. The first has been to assume that nature is important, but not essential. Most people like nature. They want to interact with it, or at least watch it on television, but it's not essential. If you take it away, we'll miss it, but it won't matter. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-size poster reflecting what our culture feels about nature. We want to save it. We want to save it for future generations, but the idea is that future generations are going to enjoy it. It suggests that nature is there just for our entertainment. I think we need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more serious. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts only to the areas where we don't have humans, that's it, we're doomed, because we've condemned them to failure. Those areas will be too small and too isolated from each other to succeed. David Quammen has this excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. This is not 71 functional Persian rugs. It's 71 rug fragments, none of which are functioning like a Persian rug. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests that there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Every place, every square inch has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides. They all have ecological significance, and we need to start treating them that way. So what we need to do is put the plants back in between our rug fragments here, glue it back together again, make a functional Persian rug out of our ecosystems. Not just make biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between good habitat, but create good habitat in between them using those powerhouse plants. Yes, we'll be there too. We're going to start to share our spaces. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on this planet. And I have no idea why, because every person on this planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. And as these ecosystems deteriorate, so does the quality of life for everybody. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Don't know. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, although it is a good living, but you can save it where you live. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. Right now, most of us feel totally unempowered. We feel powerless to address these giant environmental issues that we have. But if you plant that oak tree, plant that blueberry, the powerhouse plant wherever you live, you can go out the very next day and you can see that it is actually doing something. You become part of the future of conservation, even as a single individual. And that, that's positive motivation. It should give you hope, because it really does make a difference. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire Earth's problems. Think about just your portion of the Earth. If you own it, or if you don't own land and you're going to volunteer at the nearest park or preserve, get rid of those invasive species, cut the lawn in half, put in your pollinator garden, and put in those keystone plants. And you've done wonderful things. And if everybody did that on private land, remember, we'd be 86% done. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power. And we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we choose to do so is going to determine nature's fate, which in turn will determine our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy. That was so inspiring and informative. That's just great. So we'll take some questions. First, though, I just wanted to, again, thank you for your time with this. Thank everybody who came to listen. I also really wanted to thank our sponsors who made this possible for us. This is Dr. Tallamy's new book, Nature's Best Hope. We have some for sale at the Land Trust. Just give us a call. We'd love to put one in your hands. It's terrific. And I just, as you were talking, if anybody wants to see some sort of pollinator gardens in action, we have one at the Langley Sculpture Preserve as something that people can take a look at for inspiration or help out with if you're so inclined. So I guess, so we're gonna write your questions as you have them, and we'll spend, 5-10 minutes and get some of these. So Sherry asks, at the end of the summer, can I get feedback on which plants are useful by looking for ones with the most holes in their leaves?
Yes, that is an excellent way to do it. And that, of course, in the past, that has bothered people. If something's eating their leaves, they feel like they've got to kill it or it's going to kill the plant. I don't know where we got that idea. Most plants actually can be totally defoliated a couple times before it starts to threaten them, unless they're really declining for other reasons. But typical insect use leaves some holes in the leaves. And it's an excellent measure of of how much energy that plant has contributed to your local ecosystem. There's a woman in New Orleans, Tammany Baumgarten, who says, if the leaf damage bothers you, you should employ the 10-step program. You should take 10 steps back from your plant and all of your insect problems disappear, because you won't notice those holes at that distance. And I think that's excellent advice. Great.
So we have a couple of questions about invasives. Fast growing invasives and invasives across a large, 10 acres, for example. How did Cindy manage the getting rid of the invasives on your property?
Well, she didn't do it overnight. And of course, all the neighbors still have their invasives, so we get reinvaded all the time. We have to be vigilant. But once you get rid of the big bodies, the ones you're dealing with are the new, the yearlings, the ones that just germinate that year, and they're usually, you can just pull them out by hand. But we used every method we could. There are a lot of ways to kill plants, but the key is, if you're going to be successful, you have to kill the root system or it just keeps coming back. So mowing, if you have a field and you mow it to maintain the woody invasives, in the short term that works, but it doesn't kill the root system, which means you have to mow for the rest of your life. So I recommend spot treating where the woodies are. You shouldn't mow every year. Each piece of a field should be mowed once every 3 years or burned once every 3 years. And you should only do 1/3 of a meadow, so that the 2/3 you don't do that year can recolonize the 1/3 you did year. Of course, the big challenge is a lot of people don't want to use any herbicides these days. And, there are just different opinions about that. We tried to do it without herbicides here. Cindy will not use any herbicides, but for some of the big woodies, I would saw them off at the base and paint the trunk. I realized I'm not going to live long enough to fight the root system the rest of my life. So it uses very little material. And a lot of times it's not even enough to kill the root system. You have to do it more than once. I don't spray myself because you always hit non-targets that way. So that painting is a compromise. I consider it to be like chemotherapy. It's not something you want to do, but it can be necessary. You can beat back the root systems of invasives by continually cutting them down. But by continually, I mean once every 2 weeks until you exhaust the root system, and sometimes it takes years. Some people are willing to do that. Most people are not. So it's up to you. What's frustrating to me is that we continue to sell these plants in our nurseries, which makes it pretty frustrating. 85% of the invasive woody plants in North America are sold in the nursery trade. So, we're our own worst enemy in this regard.
Yeah. I have a question about, so, is there a difference in terms of how attractive they are to insect versus cultivars of a species versus the straight species plant?
Right. Yeah, that's a common question. If you go to the nursery and you ask for a native plant, they often sell it to you in the form of a cultivar, which is, remember, the nursery industry has been convinced for a century that you are buying the plant as a decoration. So if it's not the prettiest plant on the planet, you're not going to buy it. So they've enhanced the look or the shape of native plants in ways that they think are going to be attractive to you. So what does that mean? Well, that's a genetic variant of the particular straight species. Is it as good as the straight species in the ecological role you want it to play? We did a study looking at 6 different cultivar traits, not focused on the flower. Things like growth habit, taking a tall plant, making it short, turning green leaves into red or purple leaves, introducing leaf variegation, enhancing fall berries, fall color, disease resistance. Those are the 6 traits we looked at, and we had a big common and garden experiment where we planted the cultivars right around the straight species, and then we measured insect use, and we did that for 3 years. And we found that the only trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, which happens to be a very, very popular cultivar trait. But that's because that introduced a lot of anthocyanins into the leaf, and those are feeding deterrents. So the other traits didn't decrease insect use, but one thing that you should be aware of is that most cultivars are propagated clonally, which means there's 0 genetic variability in there. So when we load the landscape with plants with no genetic variability, the chance that they can handle the wild weather swings that we're having, we're in rough period here. We need as much genetic variability as possible. So that certainly is a downside. A lot of cultivars are focused on flowers, though. And we didn't work with flowers, but Annie White at the University of Vermont has been working with flowers. And there the news isn't quite as good because if we start fooling with flower traits, chances are good you're going to destroy the relationship between that flower and specialized bees that are depending on exactly what that flower is. So the depth of the corolla, the amount of nectar, the nutritional value of the nectar, the nutritional value of the pollen, the ultraviolet spectrum radiated by the flower, all those things can be changed when you start fooling with flowers. So she found that more often than not, fewer pollinators use the cultivar. Not always, though. So the answer really is, it depends. There are some, like there's a natural phlox found in Georgia that had twice as many flowers as the straight species. It was a natural variant. So it actually offered twice as much nectar, and yeah, more things go to it. So it's not an absolute all cultivars are bad. Um, you can test it yourself. Buy a bunch of cultivars and just see which ones are being used and which ones are not.
This question, how important are wildlife corridors to extended ranges, even between neighbors?
Very important, very important. We're actually doing starting an experiment now. I've got a new graduate student. It depends on the range of the dispersal range of the organisms you're talking about. So if you're talking about grizzly bears or something that has a range of hundreds of miles per individual, they need wildlife carters, biological carters, so they can move between habitat. I focus on insects, of course, because they're so important at the base of the food web. And I have been impressed. I mean, one of the things that you might take away from the beginning part of my talk, where I'm talking about all the things I put in my yard and then the different species finding them, even when they were miles and miles away, it shows how good the ability of insects to get around really is. The insects that found and are using the plants in the at the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, that's an isolated habitat. So what it's looking like is that insects are viewing the environment in a very coarse grain way. They have a very wide, their populations are very widely spread. And whenever they find a little patch here and there, they will use it and still be part of the greater reproductive population. So that should encourage you that even if you have a small property and it seems really isolated, do it anyway. The more people that do it, the more we will fill in these potential corridors. But insects and of course birds that move around are really good at using patchy resources as well.
Question, we live on an island and we live on a main island and have lots of ticks. People keep large lawns to cut short to minimize that risk of, real risk of tick disease. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, and paving it over will even have fewer ticks. I mean, we have too many ticks because we have too many deer. When we were growing up, we didn't have too many deer, and we had no Lyme disease. Lyme disease and deer ticks, black-legged tick, were here, but they were so low in density and numbers, nobody even knew what they were. Then our deer populations exploded because we created perfect deer habitat and we got rid of all the deer predators and when we stopped hunting. So now in most places we have 10 to 14 times more deer per square mile than the habitat can sustain indefinitely. And of course the tick populations that depend on deer exploded, and we have Lyme disease problems. Yeah, creating areas where ticks can't live will minimize your exposure. But ticks crawl up on vegetation and get on you in a process called questing. They stand on the top of a branch and they put out their little legs, and when you walk by, they grab on. And that's why they're not going to be a big problem in your lawn. But you can accomplish the same thing with swaths of grass, maybe 10 feet wide, guide you through the landscape. It minimizes the amount of area that you have in lawn, and the ticks won't be there either. It's when you're walking in the tall vegetation that they can get on you. That's a short-term response. The long-term response is to break the tick cycle someplace, and the easiest place, the most helpful place, would be to reduce deer numbers, because that's devastating our forests anyway. Very unpopular, I know.
There's a comment, someone is recommending a book, Buzz, Sting, Bite.
Oh, yeah.
By a Norwegian entomologist, and I'm not gonna attempt the name there. And about the importance of insects, bacteria, etc. Important material presented in a palatable form. So people are looking for other sources to do that.
Yeah, I wish you'd used a different title, because that's what people think of insects. They're going to buzz or sting or bite you, and they're far more than that.
Okay, just take a couple more. Let's see, do caterpillars and insects tend to eat only healthy plants?
Oh,
Notice extra damage on trees that are looking stressed out.
yeah. No. Um, as a matter of fact, there are 70 species of moths that eat dead leaves on the ground. So insects will eat all kinds of plants, and you're right. Some insects won't eat the plant unless it is stressed, because that's the way they get around those defenses. So, for example, bark beetles. The reason bark beetles can overwhelm a tree, they have an aggregation pheromone where they find a tree. The tree is too strong. The sap system, the ability to protect itself is so strong that individual bark beetles can't deal with it. So they call in thousands and they all attack it at once. And that's how they overwhelm the tree. So a weakened tree is typically more attractive to insects. Leaf eaters, they do like nice green leaves. Sometimes some species like young leaves a lot more than older leaves. Other species like older leaves a lot more than young leaves, because the phytochemicals are different at the different leaf stages. But insects are really good at using all parts of the plant at all different stages.
I guess here will be our last question. Would you like to address use of fertilizers and their impact on the landscapes, and how native plants, perhaps don't need those types of support to thrive?
Right. Particularly in our northern latitudes, the glaciers came down and scraped the ground pretty clean. And the plants that returned after the glaciers became very good at using minimal amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. In other words, they don't need a lot of fertilizer. As a matter of fact, you can kill a lot of native plants by fertilizing it. It triggers growth that they can't sustain, and their bark splits and everything else. So particularly our temperate North American plants are really good at sustaining themselves with minimal amounts of fertilizer. The best fertilizer for our native plants would be the natural fertilizers that are returned to the soil from leaf litter. So you have that cycle of nutrients being returned every single year. So if you rake your leaves and then throw it out and then fertilize, that's not nearly as good as letting the leaves break down and return soil or nutrients to the soil. So the standard horticultural practice is to fertilize like crazy, and we think that every plant requires that, but they don't. And it is very easy to put far more fertilizers than are needed on our plants, and then most of those run off into the aquatic systems and create the algal blooms and pollution problems that we have in so many of our aquatic systems. So, and that includes your lawn. You don't need fertilizer on your lawn. Just mow it. The lawn you keep should be mowed and manicured. And when you frequently mow it, it'll look like a lawn.
Well, I know that you have to go, and we appreciate everything. If people, I hope you're inspired to go out and do your part. Let us know. We'd love to kind of help support you on your quest. And we hope you will connect with us and help support the mission of our work, because we're all about being nature's best hope. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.